At this point, I think we have all of the core functionality for our backend Rails API set up, and it looks like everything's working correctly. So with that, I think we're actually ready to move over to the front end and start building out the React portion of our app. So recall that at the beginning of this, when we created our Rails app, from the command line, we included -- webpack equals React. So when we did that, we actually set up our app with Webpacker, and we configured its defaults to use React. So now if you jump into the app section here, we'll see actually this JavaScript folder inside of app. So now if you look inside of this JavaScript folder, you'll see that we have this packs folder. And the packs folder is basically by default going to have two files inside of it. So there's this application.js file, which we're not going to worry about too much right now. But we also can see we have this hello react.jsx file. And so basically in this file, we've been given a simple little example that will output, in this particular example, hello React to a page. However, we won't actually see this output anywhere because we still haven't added React into the view layer of our app. So let's go ahead and do that now. So in order to set React up as the view layer for our app, we just need to take the JavaScript pack tag and then add it to our views. So if you look in this file, you can actually see an example of the JavaScript pack tag up here in the comment. So what we can actually do is grab that, and then if we jump over into the views directory in our app, what we can basically do is just take that, and then we can either add it into the head of our application .html.erb file within our layouts folder, and that'll basically set this up so that our React gets rendered into the view layer for all of our views, or we could actually put this into an individual view file if we wanted. And I actually need to create a pages index.html.erb file for our root path. What we could do if we wanted is we could just put it in here as well. So for this case, I think we can actually just go ahead and throw it into our application html.erb file. So I'm just going to put it in the head of that file there. Or if we want, we can actually just maybe bring this to the bottom of that. So if we put that into the head of that file there, though, what we can do now is basically if we fire up our server, then we should actually see that example from inside of Hello React getting rendered now into the views in our app. So I'm going to actually just open up the server. And I'm just going to kill that and restart it. So I'm going to do Rails S to fire up our server. But so this example will basically just add Hello React. And because we just added the JavaScript pack tag into our views now, that should actually get injected into the page. So if we go over into our browser now, then what we should see now, if that all works, is basically that Hello React message getting rendered out onto the page. Cool, so it looks like everything is working, and now we actually are using React for the view layer of our application. And if you look here, you can see, for example, I have like the React Dev Tools, and you can see that we are using React now on the page. But that's basically all we have to do there. So if you see Hello React at this point displaying out onto the page, then you've successfully hooked up everything, and now React is being used for the view layer of your app, which is a pretty important step. So now back over in my code editor, I'm going to actually rename this file. So I'm just going to change this to be like index.jsx. We can do, and you don't have to do that, but if you do make that change, then make sure that you actually change the name of the file inside of the JavaScript pack tag as well. So in this case, we want to make that index instead of Hello React. But now back in our JavaScript folder, what we can do is I want to actually go ahead and create a components folder. And then inside of our components folder, let's actually go ahead and create a new file. And I'm just going to call this app.js. And so now inside of this file, let's actually go ahead and create our first React component. So I'm going to import React from React. And what we can do here is create a new just simple component called app. We can say const app equals, and all I'm going to do inside of here is return a simple hello world. So we'll do div, and we'll put in hello world, and then we just need to export default app. So then back over inside of our index.jsx file, let's go ahead and import app from, we'll do /components /app. And then what we can actually do is we can get rid of all this boilerplate that they put in here as an example, and we can actually just pass in our app component. And with that set up, if we jump back over into our browser now, we should see, if we reload that, we can actually see that now it's loading in our app component that we just created. So let's go ahead and let's actually add React Router to our project at this point. And once we do this, we'll be able to actually define a set of basically navigational components inside of our app and establish routes for each. So for example, when a user navigates to /airlines in our app, we can actually use React Router to point to a specific airlines component that we want to render. So let's actually jump over into our terminal. And I'm just going to kill the server. And so what we can do is we can actually add a package called React Router DOM. So you can use yarn or npm for this. I'm just going to use yarn, so I'm going to do yarn add React Router DOM. And so now with that added, let's actually jump back into our code. And inside of index.jsx, now we can import, we're going to import browser router as router and route from React Router DOM. And then with that added, what we can do is instead of passing in our app like this, we can actually pass in now router. And inside of that, we can actually wrap that around route. And then what we can do is inside a route, we can set the path. We can just set that to /. We can set the component that we want that to point to. And in this case, I'm going to make that app. So by doing this, we've essentially set up an indirect path for any route that will point initially to our app component. So now inside of our app component, we can actually establish all of the exact paths for our app using route and switch. So now if we jump back over to our app component, what we can do is up here we can actually import now route and switch from React Router DOM. And basically what we can do with switch is set up what I think are called like exclusive routes. But what we can do is basically add switch here. And then inside of switch, we can start to set up all of the routes for our app. So in order to do this, we can set the exact path that we want to create and provide the corresponding component that we want to route that path to. So as a starting point, I'm going to set up just a route path to point to an airlines component that we can create in a minute. And so to do that, I'm going to add route inside of switch. So let's actually do this. And I'm just going to bring that down. And then inside of switch, I'm going to create a route. And I'm going to say set the exact path to equal just our route path. And then I'm going to set up the corresponding component that I want to route that to. So in this case, we'll have a component called Airlines, which we'll create in a second here. And then additionally, I want to create a route for displaying each individual airline. And so that would traditionally be like the airline show view that corresponds to your airline show method in a typical Rails app. So to do this with React Router, we can actually pass a param on the URL when we create our route for this. So if you recall that we're using a slug parameter for displaying the individual airline in our Rails API, it would be nice to keep this kind of consistent with that. So what I want to do here is I additionally want to use a slug in the route that we're going to define here. So what we can actually do is create a new route with an exact path that we can set to the slug. So we can do something like set the exact path to /, let's say airlines, and then we can do /slug. And then we can basically point that towards an individual airline component that we can create as well. But so now with our route set up, we need to actually start to create these components. So what we can do is over in our components folder, let's create a new folder for airlines, and then let's create a new folder for airlines. We have singular and we have plural. So this singular airline directory is going to correspond with like an airline's show view for the individual airline, and then our airlines plural directory will correspond to like our airlines index, where we'll show all of the airlines. And so for as a starting point, I'm going to jump into airlines here. I'm going to create an airlines.js file, and we can create a new React component inside of that. So let's import React here. And then let's set up the basic structure of what is going to happen in this component. So basically, we want to create a new airlines component. And this is basically going to be like the airlines index view of our app. So as a starting point, I'm just going to add a div here, and I'm just going to add a little text that just says this is the airlines index view for our app. And then let's export default airlines. And then we can basically do more or less the same thing for our individual airline view. So in here, let's create an airline.js file, and then we'll create our airline component, and this will be the airline's show view of our app. So then what we can do now is back in our app file, we can actually import our airline component and our airlines component that we just created. So we can do import, let's say airlines plural from /airlines/airlines, and then we can do basically the same thing for our airline component. And so now with this setup, the routes that we established within this app component should now actually point to the correct corresponding components. So now if we jump back over into our terminal for a second, if we fire back up our server, and we navigate back over to localhost 3000, the default root path of our app now should point towards the airlines component plural. We can see that works. So we can see this is the airlines index view for our app. But now additionally, if we try to go to, let's say, airlines/delta, we can see that that'll actually go to the show view in our app. So we can see that the copy here changed to this is the airlines show view for our app. So with that, we can actually see it looks like the routing that we set up with React Router is working. So with that set up, I think we're ready to start building out our airlines and airline components. So let's start with our airlines component. So I'm going to jump back over here, and we have our airlines component over here. So as a starting point, what I want to do is actually set up some state for this component. So I'm going to change this. And so the way that I'm thinking about this is that we're basically going to fetch a list of all of the airlines from our database through our API. So what we want to do is set up airlines as a value in our state here that will initially just be like an empty array. And then what we can do is basically fill that up with airlines as we fetch them from our API. But actually I'm trying to get in the habit of using hooks more. So actually I want to try to use hooks for this. So we're going to actually from our imports up here, I'm also going to add useState and useEffect. So we're going to import those from React as well. And then what we can basically do inside its component is we can say like const airlines and set airlines and set that equal to useState. And what I want to do is set this up initially just to be an empty array. So then what we can do next is basically inside of this component, we want to make a request to our API and fetch a list of all of the airlines from our database. So what we can do is similar to component did mount, we can use useEffect, I believe. So we can basically just do like useEffect and then pass in an arrow function. And then what we can do is basically we want to get all of our airlines from our API. And then we want to update airlines in our state. So what we can do to help us make our API requests from the React side of our code is we can actually add a library called axios. And I'm going to do yarn add axios to add axios to this project. And then what we can actually do is basically just import that here and use that to make requests to our Rails API. So back in my component here, I'm going to actually import axios from axios now. And what we can do is inside of useEffect now, what we can do is say axios.get. We can pass in the URL for the API endpoint that we want to get data from. So in this case, it's going to be /API/v1/airlines.json. And then we can just chain on the .then and .catch cases. And what I want to do for now is just take the response and log it to the console. So we can do resp, and then we'll just do console.log the response. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the catch case. Because we're using useEffect, I think we need to pass in basically like a list of items so that the effect will only fire when that value changes. So I'm actually just going to get the length of our airlines array and pass that in as a second argument where we're calling useEffect. But so now let's actually fire the server back up. So over in the terminal, I'm going to do Rails S, and now let's see what gets console logged in the browser once we load the page. So let's jump back over into the browser for a second, and I'm just going to go back to the root path of this, and I'm going to open up my console here. And let's see what happens when I reload this page now. So if we look, we can see that logged out some data to the console. We have a status 200, so it looks like we hit our .then. So it looks like the API request worked. Now if we look at the actual data, we can see that we're getting back a list of all of the items from our database. So what I want to do now with that is basically jump back over into our component, and inside of our .then case, instead of just console logging out the data there, I'm going to create an arrow function, and basically inside of this, what we can do is update the airlines value in our state using that set airlines variable. So basically to do that, all we have to do is set airlines and pass in the new value that we want to add to the airlines value in our state. So in this case, it's going to be response.data .data, because if you look back at the payload that we got back, you can see it's data, and then data is where we have the array of all of our items. So now at this point, we should have airlines updated in our state with all the data from our API. So just to test this out to make sure everything's working, let's actually create a new variable. And we'll just call this list. And I want to set that equal to airlines.map. And we'll say basically item and create an arrow function. And then what I want to do is just return a list item for each airline that we have now. So I'll set the key equal to the airline's name, so item.attributes.name, and then we'll also set the actual value we're passing in here as item.attributes.name. But then what we should be able to do now is basically just take this list variable, and down below we can create, for example, an unorganized list, and then we can just pass that in here. And because we have two top level items, let's import fragment as well from React, and then we can just wrap this in a fragment. But let's see now. So if we go back and we reload the page now with that, we can see now we're getting a list of all of our airlines names. So it looks like everything is working. So now that we actually have our data, let's actually set up this component. So what we can do is inside of this, the first thing I want to do is create just like a header section for this component. So I'm just going to create a new div and give this a class name of header for now. And inside of this, let's include an h1. So this will be the primary header tag. So we're just going to add the name of the site there. And then underneath that, I want to include basically like a subheader section. So basically like the tagline of the site. So I'll give this a class name of like subheader for now. And basically we're just going to give this like a basic tagline of what the site is about. So that's going to be the top header section here. And then underneath that, we can actually get rid of this placeholder now. And what I want to do is basically just create like a wrapper for what's going to end up being our grid on the home page here. So basically we can give this a class name for now of just grid. And this is going to wrap that list that we're going to create. And we can probably actually just get rid of fragment and just use a div for this. And I'll give that a class as well. We'll just call that home for now. And let's go back and just make sure that that all works so far. Nice. Okay, so now what I want to do is basically back inside of our airlines folder here, I want to actually create another component that's going to represent the individual grid item for when we create a grid of basically all of our airlines for the home page. So what I'm going to do is create a new file in here. And I'm actually just going to call this airline.js singular. But then what we can do is jump over here. We can create a component for what the individual grid item will look like that we can then bring back over into airlines, and we can actually pass that in for our list that we're going to build here. So we'll use that to create basically like a grid on the homepage. So back in airline, let's actually import React from React. And then I'm just going to create a new component and call it airline. So we'll do airline and we'll do an arrow function, and then inside of this, I want to return basically just the structure of what we want the grid item to look like for each airline. So what I'm going to do is create a new div in here, and I'm just going to give that a class name of card. So this will be like the individual card item or grid item that we're going to use. So I'm just going to call that card, and then inside of that, basically we can just include all of the information that we want to show in our grid for each individual airline. And this is where we can start to actually use the data that we're passing through from our API as those attribute values. So in this case, we have the airline's name, we have the image URL, we have the actual rating score, and then we have the slug for the airline. So let's create just sections in here where we can start to pass through some of that data. So I'm going to give this section a class name of just airline logo, and then below that, I'm also going to want to have the airline's name. And then additionally, we want to have the airline score, which is going to be the average rating for the airline based off all of its review scores. And then we also are going to want to have a link that goes from this item into the individual airline show page. So again, this is going to be a grid that's going to show on the home page. And so this will be a link that actually links you out to the individual airline page. So we'll just call this like airline link for now. So we should have all the data for this that we need back in our airlines component for making that initial API request. So what we'll end up wanting to do is pass that down as props into this component. So what we can do is basically modify this so that it's taking in props as an argument here. And then for each of these attributes, we can actually just add those in now as props, and then that'll be dot attributes dot, in this case, image URL. And we want to actually put that inside of an image tag. So we can actually do something like this. We do image and say source equals that value. We can actually give that an alt as well and make that props dot attributes dot name. And then for name, we can just grab this again. So we can do props dot attribute dot name there. And then for the score, we actually need to add that back into our serializer in a second. But basically, we want to just pull in the average score for the airline here. And then for the link, we can actually structure that using the airline's unique slug. But what we want to do is basically add like an anchor tag here and set the href value to be /airlines. And then if we use, let's say maybe backticks here, then what we can do is just use string interpolation to actually pass in the slug value. So we can do props.attributes.slug to form the actual anchor tag there. So let's export this component. So we'll do export default airline, and then back inside of airlines now we can actually we can just do import airline from airline, and then we need to, over in our serializer, for our airline serializer, we need to actually add in the average score. So we already added that method in our airline model, so we can just add that onto our serializer here. And what we can do now is back in our airlines component, instead of passing in this list down here, so now that we're importing airline up here, we can actually just create a new airline component when we iterate over our list of airlines. So let's say I'm going to rename this variable to grid. And what we can do is basically create a new airline component for each item. And then I'm going to set up all of the attributes that we want to pass into this. So let's get rid of that. Actually, we can get rid of that and close that. And then we need to pass in basically attributes now. So we can say so attributes for each airline is going to equal item dot attributes. And then let's replace list down here with just grid. And now let's see if that works. So I'm just going to jump back into the browser and refresh that. And it looks like we're actually getting an error from our API. So let's jump back over here. It looks like we're trying to call round on nil. So we jump back over into our airline model. So it looks like the issue is basically the case where an airline doesn't have any reviews. We try to call that on it. So what we can do is actually, we can put in a guard here and just say return 0 if reviews.count, or unless reviews.count is positive, let's say. And that'll just make sure that we only do this if an airline has at least one review. Otherwise, it'll just return 0 for the score here. So let's just jump back over here and try to reload that again. And it looks like that worked. So we can see basically we're loading in that data for all of our airlines. So the first case here, we can see we have the image and the name for United Airlines. And we see we actually have the average score for that airline. So if you remember, we basically created one review earlier that had a score of 5 and one with a score of 1. So we can see the average for that is 3. And then we can see all of our other airlines here as well, but none of them actually have reviews yet. So let's jump back over into our code for a second. And one thing that we need to do back in our airline component, because we're using React Router, we actually need to, instead of using an anchor tag with an href, we actually need to import something called link from React Router DOM. And then we need to use that to set up our links for this. So what we can do is basically, at the top of our file, let's do import, and we'll do browser router. as router and link from React router DOM. And then all we have to do is down here, instead of using an anchor tag, we can actually use link. So we'll take that. So we'll change that to link. And then instead of href, we want to change that to be 2. And that'll basically just work the exact same as if it was an anchor tag. But what we can do now is we can actually go ahead and start to style out our airlines and airline component here and start to build the structure of what our homepage and our airlines grid is going to look like. So to do that, I'm actually going to import a library called styled components. So I'm going to do yarn add styled components to add that to this project. Not everybody likes styled components, so feel free to do it your own way. But what we can do now is back in, let's start inside of our airlines component. Let's actually import styled components now. So I'm going to add import styled from styled components here. And then what we can do is actually start to create a set of variables with the styling we want, and we can apply that to the HTML elements that we have down below. So if we actually look at what we have so far, we can see we have these grouped in this way where we have like a kind of a home section, and then a header section, and then a subheader and a grid. So what we can probably do is actually create variables for each of those. So I'm going to create a const called home initially, and just set that equal to style.div. And then I'm just going to do the same thing for, we'll call this our header and our subheader, and then our grid. So now we can basically just go ahead and start adding style to each of these. So I'm going to start with the home item here, and I'm just going to add some basic styling to what's going to be kind of the wrapper of this entire section for us. So initially I'm just going to set text line center to center our content, and then I'm also going to set a max width. For now I'm just going to make that like 1200 pixels, and then I'm also going to give this margin left and margin right auto. And then basically what we can do with that though is we can take this const and we can actually replace the element down below in our JSX. So instead of this div with the class name of home, we can actually just create a home kind of wrapper component there that will take in that style that we set for that component. So similarly for this header wrapper, we can go back up here and we can add some style for that as well. And for this, I basically just want to add some padding to that. So I'm going to do padding 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 10 pixels, and 100 pixels. And then I also want to style the H1 that is going to be inside of this. So I'm just going to give that a specific font size. So let's give that a font size of like 42 pixels. And then we can grab this header and we can actually replace that down below as well. And then for our subheader, for that I'm just going to set a specific font weight and a specific font size. And then we can add that. And then most importantly, we need to set up our grid. So for this, I'm actually going to use CSS grid. So I'm going to set display to grid for that. And then what we can do is actually set grid template columns on this, and we can set this up so that we'll have basically a grid with 4 columns. So what we can do is say repeat 4 and then 1 FR or 1 fraction. And then I'm going to set a grid gap on this to be 20 pixels. And I'm going to set the width of this to be 100%. And then I'm also just going to give this some padding. So let's do that, and then let's actually throw this down below. So we'll replace this section with grid. And then let's see what that looks like so far. So if we jump back into our terminal, we need to fire back up our server. And then we can jump back over into our browser and take a look at that. And it looks like we might be running into a little issue with the size of the images here. So let's jump back over, and inside of the individual airline component, let's actually import style components here as well. And let's set up a few components here as well. So I'm going to create a card component. I'm also going to create, let's call this airline logo. And then we can also do airline name. And then let's create a link wrapper for our link as well. And then for my card, I'm going to add, we're going to add a border. So we'll do 1 pixel solid, and we'll just do like a light color for our border. And then I'm just going to set the background for each card to be white. So let's add that. And then for our airline logo, so for this is going to wrap the image. So what I want to do is let's set like a width of 50 pixels here. And then what we can do is actually style the image inside of this as well. So I'm going to say, let's give this a height of 50 pixels, a width of 50 pixels. And then let's give this a border radius of 100%. And let's give this a border that we'll do, again, like 1 pixel solid, and then we'll do a light color for that as well. And let's actually apply that now to this section. And then for airline name, all that I want to do is just add a little bit of padding. So we'll just do 20 pixels, 0, 10 pixels, 0. And then for the link wrapper, let's give this some margin. So we'll do like 30 pixels, 0, 20 pixels, 0. And then we also want to give this, I'm going to give this just a fixed height of, let's say, 50 pixels again. And then we can actually add some style for the anchor tag inside of that. And in this case, this link component is just going to convert into basically an anchor tag. And what we can do is apply some style to that. So let's say for the anchor tag, we want to give this a color of white and a background color of black. And then we can give that like a border radius of, let's say, like 4 pixels, and we can give that some padding as well. So maybe we'll do like 10 pixels and 50 pixels. And then we're going to give this a border that's just going to match the color of the background. So we'll say this will also be black. And then let's also set this to a width of 100%. And let's also give this text decoration none. And then let's add these into our JS text below. So we'll give this to our airline link section. We'll change that to link wrapper. We'll change this to airline name. And then we'll come back for the score momentarily. But let's take a look at what that looks like now. So if I jump back over into our browser, if we reload that, that's starting to look pretty good. It looks like the only issue is that the image now isn't centered inside of the actual card. So let's jump back and see if we can fix that. So let's see if we actually do text align center for that. And let's see. So we have airline logo, and that is inside a card. So let's actually see if we center card as well. Okay, so that's starting to look pretty good. So the last thing that I want to do is just a little bit of cleanup around our airlines component and the airline component that we use for the grid. But then we can move on to the actual individual airlines show section. So if we jump back over into our code, so the first thing I want to do is Actually, I want to jump over into our airlines component. And what I want to do here is just clean up useEffect a little bit. So we can get rid of those comments, and then we can actually probably just turn this into like a one-liner. So all we're doing there is just setting airlines in our state in this component based off the data that we're getting back from the API. And then in the catch case, if something goes wrong, we'll log that to the console, so we'll see that. So otherwise, I think this looks pretty good for now. There's just one small issue that I still want to take care of before we move forward, which is, so if we jump back over here, so the current flow is that we have this grid of all of the airlines, and each link is going to point to the individual show URL for that specific airline. So if we jump back into our code, we can see inside of this component, we added a link here. That's going to link to the airline's individual page based off of its slug. So there's a little bit of an issue that's going to happen right now. So we can take a look. If, for example, we say we try to go to this page, we can see that initially everything works fine. So we go to the show view, we can see that we have the appropriate slug. But now if we try to go back to the index, we'll see that we get some pretty strange behavior. So actually, let's try that again. So I'm going to reload that. So let's see if we go to the individual view for, in this case, our first airline. And then if we just click the back button on the browser, we see we end up with just a blank screen. So the way that we can fix this is just by disabling turbolinks in the app. So let's actually jump back over in here. And we just need to remove turbolinks from a couple places. So over inside of app, if we jump back down into, let's go into our views actually. So if we go into application HTML ERB, we can see we have these style sheet and JavaScript tags that are both loading in turbolinks. So what we can actually do as a starting point is probably just get rid of turbolinks from that. And then we can also, in our JavaScript folder, if we look inside of packs, we can see that we're doing something with turbolinks over here. And we can actually just try to see what happens if we just get rid of that as well. So I'm going to comment that out. And then finally, I just want to go and actually remove the gem itself from my gem file. So I'm just going to comment out turbolinks there. And then let's actually kill our server. And let's run bundle install. And let's start the server back up. I'm also in a separate tab, just going to do Webpack dev server. But now let's just jump back over into the browser and see if that fixes that issue. So I'm going to reload the home page, and then let's just again try to go to an individual show view and then back. And we can see now it looks like everything's working fine.